Wonderful. Well, I am very happy to have Christina Petterson here today. She's going to be speaking first, and then I'll be talking. Christina is an adjunct lecturer at the University of Greenland. Her background is in theology and cultural studies, and her research interests concern the relationship between Christianity and social history in the 18th century, both in the colonies and Europe. Christina's most recent monograph is The Moravian Brethren in a Time of Transition, a socioeconomic analysis of a religious community in 18th century Saxony, published by in the Historical Materials series. And her forthcoming book is titled Early Capitalism in Colonial Missions, Moravian Household Economies in the Global 18th Century, which will be published by Bloomsbury early next year.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Jennifer and Gabriel for having me here. So the paper I passed around is from a conference paper that I gave in 2014, and when I was preparing for today, it struck me just how much the world had changed in this decade, and how my arguments against postcolonialism are made against assumptions which are no longer dominating, not due to the theoretical marketplace and its ever-changing trends, but due to the changing geopolitical structures. And we're witnessing, I think, genuine socioeconomic change rather than counter-revolutionary gestures, which is where I've come to see postcolonial theory. My main approach to theory is through the prism of theology, and the article distributed here is somewhat of an exception. But I began to look into postcolonial theory as part of my research in biblical studies in early 2000s, and eventually received a PhD scholarship in Australia to work on postcolonial biblical interpretation in Greenland. For context, Greenland is a former colony of Denmark and is now part of the Danish Commonwealth, and I myself am from Denmark. The department I was in Sydney was a cultural studies department, so basically theory heavy with emphasis on gender, queer studies, fat and modification studies, and already waning in 2006, postcolonial studies. Australia is one of the places where postcolonial theory was consolidated as a literary theory in the late 1980s, and through fellow students I learned of some of the more severe criticisms of this theoretical approach by Aboriginal academics who referred to it as post-colonizing because they saw this theory as white fella business and did nothing to improve the condition of the indigenous population, but instead papered over injustices and systemic inequality. And white fellow is a non-Aboriginal settler. One of the things I struggled with early on in my postgraduate work was the application of a theory developed on the basis of British imperialism in India and the Middle East to analyze Danish colonialism in Greenland. And Danish colonialism in Greenland took place through dispersed trade settlements and monopoly, missionary work, and in-depth social engineering, which in connection with Danish imperial history in general produced a different colonial situation. I was also very dissatisfied with how Danish academics would push aside the many differences in favor of concepts such as Arctic Orientalism. And I then became engaged in a battle royal with my supervisor on Christianity in Greenland, which they wanted me to analyze from a post-colonial perspective and emphasize how the indigenous population appropriated Christianity in their own way, creating a hybrid Christianity. The problem is that in Greenland, Christianity is emphatically not hybrid or highly indigenous, but very, very Lutheran, and the few so-called unauthorized movements were regarded as deeply heretical by most of the indigenous population. Finally, the time spent in Greenland had shown me the atrocious social inequality of the Greenlandic society and the social destruction left behind by capitalism and colonialism. I think I then realized that postcolonial theory was white fella business, and not only could it not help me work through all these nuances and problems, but that this theoretical framework actually prevented me from drawing out the full and deep implications of colonization, and instead leaving things fairly untouched, although sounding very empowering and radical. Postcolonial theory is, in other words, a strategy of containment. And strategy of containment is a term used by Marxist literary scholar Frederick Jameson to refer to those limits which produce ideological closure and which make it impossible for thinking to move beyond these imposed categories. The fullest discussion of this concept appears in his 1978 critique of literary theory in general and of Kenneth Burke in particular. In this article, Jameson is exploring the extent to which Burke's theoretical framework can be reworked as a model for proper ideological analysis, which for Jameson is a form of criticism which moves through the material to arrive at the social, historical, and political parameters of the ultimate horizon of interpretation, and this is what he does in The Political Unconscious. What Burke does, according to Jameson, is to insert a roadblock, in this case a specific literary genre, Romanticism, as the ultimate horizon of interpretation of that's Burke's analysis of Keats. And Jameson says that Burke thus fixes his interpretation in the history of ideas. And it is this movement of shortening the horizon of interpretation to some premature instance, which does not address the proper ideological issue. And there's a quote from Jameson: "This way of constructing Romanticism by projecting a situation which is its own response seals us off from any further need to consult the historical circumstances of Romanticism itself and makes this particular superstructural subtext a kind of autoreferential causa sua." What we are, end quote, what we are left with, another quote, is Burke's implicit faith in the harmonizing claims of liberal democracy and in the capacity of the system to reform itself from within, end quote. So strategies of containment are deliberate ideological moves, and to unmask them, they must be confronted with, quote, the idea of totality which they at once imply and repress, end quote. And this is where biblical scholarship is so much fun, because apart from the restraints of liberalism in biblical scholarship, which have developed since the Enlightenment, there are other theological and political containment strategies which go back to the very early centuries of our common era. Canonization comes to mind, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. The topic here is postcolonial theory. In his article on the relationship between postcolonial criticism and global capitalism, the late Arif Derlich distinguishes between three uses of the term postcolonial. A, as a literal description of conditions in formerly called colonial societies, in which case the term has concrete reference, as in postcolonial societies or postcolonial intellectuals. B, as a description of a global condition after the period of colonialism, in which case the usage is somewhat more abstract and less concrete in reference, comparable in its vagueness to the earlier term Third World, for which it is intended as a substitute. And C, as a description of a discourse on the above-named conditions that is informed by the epistemological and psychic orientations that are the products of those conditions. So I'm mainly referring to the third use when I speak of postcolonial theory, the theoretical apparatus which has given us terms such as mimicry, hybridity, ambivalence, displacement to theorize the sentiments of subjectivities trapped between the so-called first and third worlds. Seeing postcolonialism as a strategy of containment means three things. Well, probably more, but I've focused on three. First, that it is fixed in the realm of individualism, more precisely, identity and experience. In its articulation of the experiences of individuals caught between the worlds of the colonizer and the native, postcolonial theory claims to represent people who were not previously representable. It gives claim to give voice to those who did not previously have a voice, to shine the light on those who were up until now in darkness. In a Greenlandic context, this had immense appeal because it enabled Greenlandic university students to articulate a position relative to their own situation, maybe hybridity, and seize representation. Their reaction was in response to two main modes of stereotypical representation of Greenlandic people within the Danish Commonwealth. Namely, one, either as a people in harmony with nature within Greenland, or as homeless substance abusers on the streets of Copenhagen. So the theoretical framework of postcolonialism enabled a group to self-represent as independent and resourceful individuals while giving voice to their situation of being neither nor within Danish Greenlandic society. this sense of self incidentally aligned with the political standpoint of the Greenlandic elite. In other words, not beyond the colonial structures at all, but contained within the class structures of capitalism and masked by the individual of liberalism. This specific class structure was socially engineered by Danish colonial powers in the 18th and 19th centuries through strict regulations as to who could marry whom, dependent on one's racial makeup and employment. And this is one of the main problems with postcolonial theory, that it does not pay attention to socio-economic history and class. The individual class-blind perspective is certainly no new point. It was noted already in the mid-1990s in the work of Arif Derlik and Ahmed Ajaz, who both noted that postcolonial theory draws attention to a very small and very privileged segment of populations of former colonized nations. Indeed, Derlik's article mentioned above is a pretty harsh indictment of a number of postcolonial intellectuals. Both Derlik and Ahmad criticized postcolonial intellectuals for not acknowledging their privileged positions and class backgrounds, which create the conditions from which they speak and what they assume as normal. As Ahmad notes, quote, history does not consist of perpetual migration, so that the universality of displacement that Homi Bhabha claims, both as the general human condition and the desirable philosophical position, is tenable neither as a description of the world nor as a generalized political possibility, end quote. This universalizing from a particular perspective is, of course, a hallmark of liberal bourgeois thinking and not restricted to postcolonialism. The second way in which postcolonialism functions as a strategy of containment is an extension of this disregards of one's own socio-economic location, that it is ahistorical, which of course is also connected to liberal ideology and the notion of the autonomous self. Not only does postcolonial theory disregard the histories of the various former colonies, it also disregards much of the previous work of postcolonialism, work from the 1970s, which dealt much more with issues and conditions in formerly colonial societies, where there is a concrete reference point, such as postcolonial India or postcolonial Algeria, as referring to the period after independence. Postcolonial theory presents itself as having no history, neither at the level of individual practitioners or methodologically. And this makes it all the more urgent to examine precisely what its history is, which is what I set out to do in the Second World Cold War ideology and the development of postcolonial criticism, which I passed around. Within this problem of history, we need to look at the third point of containment, and that is postcolonial's dismissal of the nation-state and the celebration of globalization. Arif Derlik determines the beginning of the postcolonial with the emergence of global capital, not, he adds, quote, in the sense that of an exact coincidence in time, but in the sense that the one is a condition for the other, end quote. He points out that postcoloniality is a response to the need to overcome a crisis of understanding, quote, produced by the inability of old categories to account for the world, but that it is designed to avoid making sense of the current crisis and in the process to cover up the origins of postcolonial intellectuals in a global capitalism of which they are not so much victims as beneficiaries, quote. It thus, quote again, apologize, it thus disguises the power relations that shape a seemingly shapeless world and contributes to a conceptualization of that world that both consolidates and subverts possibilities of resistance, end quote. And in response to Kwame Apia's statement that postcoloniality is the condition of a comprador intelligentsia, Derlik responds that this is missing the point because, quote, the world situation that justified the term comprador no longer exists, end quote. The idea of comprador then is tied to the colonial world and a colonial mindset of which nation-state and nationalism is a key feature. The hybrid postcolonial subject transcends, in theory anyway, all ideas of nationhood and instead celebrates culturalism and transnationalism. Once one has dismissed nation-states as an outdated and colonial way of thinking, one has also, by the same stroke, done away with any notion of political and economic independence and sovereignty. And the world of Bandung is a thing of the past. So, in the article I submitted, I situated the consolidation and rise of postcolonial theory and the breakup of the communist bloc between 1989 and 1991. And I just want to close by returning to this argument, because the term strategy of containment used by Jameson is actually, as Roland reminded me recently, Cold War terminology coined by American diplomat in Moscow, George F. Kennan, in July 1947. Kennan called for, quote, a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansion tendencies, end quote, which came to characterize U.S. policy towards the USSR in different ways during the Cold War. The fulfillment of this was, according to John Lewis Gaddis, when Reagan completed what Kennan had anticipated by enlisting a Soviet leader in the task of altering his own regime. The study, Strategies of Containment, a critical appraisal of American national security policy during the Cold War, by Gaddis, concludes, quote, indeed, it is difficult to think of any peacetime grand strategy in which the results produced in the end corresponded more closely with the objectives specified at the beginning, end quote. The strategy, then, is a deliberate, insidious ideological weapon designed to block any challenge to the system in whose service it operates. And a couple of years ago, I probably would not have gone so far as to designate postcolonial theory as a political strategy of containment. But after familiarizing myself with Gabriel Rockhill's work, I am past such naivete, and I did some research assistance work for a professor of education, and I had occasion to sort through his archive of the educational strategy of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, established in 1961, and that was certainly also an eye-opener in terms of Cold War strategies and education. And these were declassified documents, so there was really lots of goodies in there. When looking at the developments of the world after 1991, the second world, so-called second world, was fragmented into a number of independent states, some forcefully, such as Yugoslavia, but for the third world we get postcolonial criticism as a way of containing the forces of liberalism which were unleashed in the socialist states. On the one hand, this may sound a little far-fetched, but if one considers the location of centers of postcolonial studies, North America and Australia, and the fact that international students receive scholarship from God knows where to go and learn about postcolonialism in these centers, in many cases with professors from formerly colonized countries, then it is perhaps not quite as far-fetched. And I was also asked to develop and teach a course on postcolonial biblical criticism at the University of Oslo in Norway, which turned out to be for a couple of international scholarship students from Ghana and Tanzania. And that really made me think about the global dynamics of the whole thing. So I have reached my conclusion, and I would like to summarize that the containment strategies of postcolonialism are, first, its individualism, representation, and universalism. Second, its ahistorical nature, which lends little or no importance to the struggle of independence movements, the histories of colonies or of the individual practitioner. And finally, third, the dismission, sorry, my tongue is not cooperating. And finally, the dismissal of the nation state and the celebration of globalization. While these are all generated in the realm of literary theory, they nevertheless may be seen as attempts at producing desirable ideological effects of containing nationalist and independence movements, privileging certain beneficial viewpoints, and supporting the post-Cold War world order for a very short while. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina, for that excellent talk, which I feel has a lot of resonance with my own. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So for a very long time, I've been interested in researching analyses of imperialism, colonialism and racism in global Marxist thought. And more recently, I've been trying to kind of more systematically compare this to some of the treatment of these phenomena in academic discourses that are very predominant in the US, including postcolonial theory and decolonial theory. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to connect back to the Losurdo's critique of Western Marxism and Western critical theory that I discussed last week, because part of the framing that I'm hoping to provide is also looking at the ways that the political economy of contemporary imperialism shapes the production and dissemination of knowledge. I'm going to focus more on decolonial theory, which I think is in some ways picking up on many of the tendencies that Christina also identified. And I wanted to focus on it, for one, because of its ubiquity in a lot of the fields that I work in, cultural studies, Latin American and Latinx cultural studies, and it's also been exported around the world and to Latin America. Now, and I'm also interested in decolonial theory because it ostensibly speaks to a topic that I'm profoundly interested in, but I think that it doesn't give us a proper grasp of the phenomena that it purports to describe, and instead it actively is burying historical materialist analytical frameworks that are in fact very useful. And I also want to show that it also traffics in all kinds of essentialist, idealist, and ultimately reactionary presumptions. I'm going to be building on excellent critiques that have already been made of decolonial theory by people like Neil Larson, Antonio Vázquez Arroyo, Pierre Gaussans, Guy Markarian, Eli Portela, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. I'll provide you all with a bibliography after my talk. So, decolonial theory specifically refers to the work of the Modernity, Coloniality, Decoloniality Network, which is a group of US and Latin American academics who popularized this Anglophone neologism. They assert that their theories constitute a distinct school of thought that transcends previously established paradigms for examining decolonialism and decolonization, including anti-colonial thought, as well as post-colonial thought and subaltern studies. Walter Mignolo, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Ramon Boschvogel, Santiago Castro Gomez have all positioned themselves as spokespersons for this network. I also want to emphasize that this specific school of thought is the object of my critique because the term decolonial has also been used to rebrand thinkers that should be more properly understood as anti-colonial, like Walter Rodney, Frantz Fanon, and others. So quickly I want to outline some of the key precepts of decolonial theory. So first, it's concerned with provincializing the epistemological features of modern Western civilization, which it claims underlie all knowledge produced in the imperialist core, as well as people's understanding of themselves and their relationships to others in the natural world. Second, they argue that these epistemological characteristics are the principal cause of social conflicts and oppression. And I want to note that very similar assumptions as the two that I just mentioned underlie other idealist theoretical approaches that are very popular in the US Academy, including Afro-pessimism and some versions of whiteness studies and postcolonial theory. Now, decolonial theorists are principally concerned with the persistence of colonial social relations, and namely racism, after the end of formal colonialism. And they use the term coloniality to refer to these post-independence colonial situations. Finally, and this follows from their focus on epistemology, the practice of decolonization that they call for principally involves thinking differently. As Erica Beckman, Oded Mir, and Emilio Sardi write, quote, in contrast to the decolonization movements of the post-war period that sought to wrest state power from colonial and imperialist command, decolonial thinking aims at, quote, delinking from the assumptions of modern Western epistemology, or Eurocentrism. Now, Walter Mignolo justifies this singular focus on epistemology by arguing that it responds to changed historical circumstances since the end of the Cold War, as imperialism without colonies became the norm. And it is indeed the case that in the latter part of the 20th century, imperialist strategy was transformed as it was forced to respond to people's successful struggles against colonialism, including its fascist incarnation. The ruling classes of the imperialist core seized control of the economies and therefore also the political policies of formerly independent nations, producing formerly independent states that suffer from economic dependency and the persistent threat of military aggression. Of course, this occurred earlier for national states in Latin America and the Caribbean who achieved political independence in the 19th century. Now, the form of imperialism that does not involve direct colonial administration has long been known as neocolonialism. Kwame Nkrumah famously wrote a book with this title in 1965 when he was president of Ghana, and decades before that, Lenin used the term semi-colonialism to identify situations where imperialists' economic annexation of a country didn't also involve its political annexation. Thus, one must wonder why decolonial theorists want to substitute their concept of coloniality for neocolonialism, especially since much of the extensive literature on neocolonialism emerged directly from the political struggles of people in the Global South. Engaging with this history would certainly put into question decolonial theorists' suggestion that struggles against so-called coloniality should be waged primarily on an epistemic plane. Important theorists of neocolonialism, including persons who have led political struggles against it, have explicitly argued that, like traditional colonialism, neocolonialism needs to be combated politically, economically, and militarily. For example, Che Guevara stated at the Afro-Asian Conference in 1965, quote, "The struggle against imperialism for liberation from colonial or neo-colonial shackles, which is being carried out by means of political weapons, arms, or a combination of the two, is not separate from the struggle against backwardness and poverty." So how do we explain decolonial theorists' relative silence regarding theories of neocolonialism, which again have been primarily produced by people in the Global South? On a superficial level, this can be seen as an unfortunate but not uncommon expression of the opportunism the neoliberal academic labor market encourages, where academic workers are rewarded for producing new or apparently new theoretical commodities that are pitched to achieve brand recognition. But more fundamentally, this is a symptom of decolonial theorists' explicit antipathy to Marxism and Marxist-inspired political movements. And this is also something it shares with dominant strains of postcolonial theory, as well as idealist ontologizing theories of race like Afro-pessimism. In claiming that their theory transcends purported epistemic limitations of Marxism, decolonial theorists traffic in profoundly dishonest mischaracterizations of Marxist thought and socialist history. I won't go into great detail in this, but I do want to note that the Guyanese historian Walter Rodney and the Argentine philosopher Nestor Cojan are just two scholars who have masterfully debunked the charge of Marxism's Eurocentrism. Most importantly, the decolonial theorist's claims that Marxism is an irredeemably Western paradigm are refuted by the history of Marxist-inspired movements from the Global South and the knowledge they have produced. As Eli Portella Perreras has correctly noted, decolonial theorists' accounts of Marxism systematically erase the long and rich history of anti-colonial Marxism or national liberation Marxism, including its sophisticated theories of epistemology. So, while declaring themselves to be the champions of or guardians of subaltern knowledges, these theorists systematically invisibilize political and intellectual histories of oppressed people who have struggled to liberate themselves from imperialism. And like post-colonial theory, decolonial theory completely erases the Soviet Union's crucial historical role in creating an international culture of anti-imperialism and supporting struggles against colonialism and neocolonialism across the Global South. Now, when theorists like Vignolo argue that Marxism cannot lend itself to struggles for decolonization because it is a product of Western modernity, they elide Marxism's dedication to the critique and overcoming of capitalist modernity. Moreover, as Antonio Vázquez Arroyo has argued, this manner of adjudicating the value and relevance of ideas based on their purported origin disavows the actual ways in which ideas and concepts evolve, acquiring new meanings and associations and shedding others as they are used and transformed by people living in distinct historical situations. These claims also rely on an idealist and ahistorical division of human history and knowledge into Europe and its others. Neil Lazarus has critiqued similar tendencies in postcolonial theory, wherein modernity is read in culturalist terms rather than in reference to capitalism's global development, and the West or Europe is treated as an undifferentiated unity to which an essential identity or personality is imputed. Lazarus correctly warns that such essentialist representations reduplicate the logic of racist and Eurocentric discourses while simply inverting the values that they had accorded to the West and its others. Now, for decolonial theorists, such sweeping, undialectical accounts of intellectual history also constitute a rhetorical tactic whereby these intellectuals attempt to establish their own authority as mediating representatives of a vaguely defined non-Western alterity. Decolonial theory's culturalism and idealism underlie the problems I've identified in it, and it shares these features with many other academic trends that present themselves as progressive and even radical, while in fact trafficking in reactionary forms of thought. Culturalist arguments treat selected cultural and ideological traits in an ahistorical manner, ignoring the specificities of the historical processes that gave rise to them, and they then imbue these traits with transhistorical permanence and universal explanatory power. As Neil Larson puts it in a recently published critique of decolonial theory, culturalism amounts to, quote, the theory that cultural and ethnic identities and differences are what ultimately explain the world. Decolonial theorists' embrace of culturalism is evidenced in their insistence that cultural and epistemological characteristics of the West constitute the principal cause of historical developments and social conflicts, including racism, war, and conquest. When historical causality is attributed to purported cultural invariance, such as the so-called Western episteme, we learn nothing of the practices, institutions, and social relations that shape humans' consciousness and culture. Marxist intellectuals have consistently critiqued modes of argumentation that naturalize culture. And it is worth remembering that when Marxism was first developed in the 19th century, it both refuted and offered an alternative to the racist and culturalist interpretations of social conflict that were predominant within Europe at that time. Contemporary Marxist intellectuals have also critiqued culturalism for being tautological and historically inaccurate, and also for trafficking in racist presumptions. The African-American political scientist Adolph Reed Jr. argues that, quote, the naturalization of culture as an independent force is a vestige of assumptions concerning the existence of racial temperaments. The Egyptian political economist Samir Amin argues that culturalism has historically been inextricable from discourses and practices of racism. And for Amin, culturalism is a cornerstone of bourgeois ideology that has historically been used to obscure the nature of capitalist reproduction and thereby hide the real causes of the oppression and inequality it generates. Examples of this kind of culturalist thinking include the imperialist discourse of civilizational tutelage, underclass ideology, and the notion that geopolitical conflict is the result of a so-called class of civilizations. Amin also specifically argues that culturalism is a weapon of US imperialism, whose efforts to manage the whole world like a market require a practical destruction of state forces in favor of an impotent communalism encouraged by ideological mobilization around culturalist objectives. A similar argument has been advanced by the Mexican anthropologist Pablo González Casanova, who has argued that culturalist interpretations of social conflicts bolster colonial politics by occluding class struggle in the operations of imperialism, and by promoting an exaltation of different identities as a means of increasing the isolation and balkanization of peoples subject to colonialism. Now, the culturalism of decolonial theory is also an example of its philosophical idealism. By this, I'm referring to a worldview that holds that the material world is shaped by forces that operate independently of it, such as metaphysical entities, spirits, or ideas or discourses detached from their material base in social relations. Decolonial theory exemplifies an idealist approach to history insofar as it treats ideologies as super-historical structures that organize social relations across time and in distinct historical contexts. For example, we see this in Mignolo's argument that colonial epistemology has organized social relations in the Americas since the Iberian conquest in the 15th century up to the present. This is an essentially tautological assertion insofar as the very thing that demands historical explanation, human consciousness, is instead dehistoricized and treated as a transcendent historical cause. Now, in the 1990s, the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano coined the concept of coloniality that was later popularized by decolonial theorists. For Quijano, coloniality names a, quote, model of power that emerged with the conquest of the Americas, and it is characterized by the classification of populations according to racial ideologies and the articulation of all modes of production around capitalist social relations. Now, in the most general sense, this describes something true, but this concept flattens history and erases crucial differences among localities and periods. As the Argentine historian Ricardo Salvatore has noted, the articulation of racial classificatory schemes with the social relations of production has not remained static over 5 centuries, which saw different waves of imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism, the abolition of slavery, struggles for democratization, and so on. But the static structuralist cast of the concept of coloniality discourages concreteness in historical analysis. We cannot hope to understand, for example, why and how racism takes on new forms as labor practices change by referring to an essentially metaphysical model of power whose own mechanisms of operation and reproduction across time and space are not explained. This points to an essential difference between idealist methods of decolonial theory and the historical materialist approach to investigating human consciousness. As we discussed last week, the Marxist theory of ideology is based on the understanding that human consciousness develops as part of a complex social totality overdetermined by the social relations of production. While people may experience consciousness in such a way as to believe that ideas originate in a purely conceptual realm, this is because the objective social forces shaping ideology are hidden from them. An understanding that ideology is pragmatic, grounded in material practices, and that it evolves as a constitutive element of social relations that are anchored in the capitalist mode of production, provides a base for historical materialist analyses of racism, Eurocentrism, and cultural imperialism. And I want to provide a very brief overview of some of the signal contributions from the Marxist tradition, which have actually had real traction in concrete struggles for decolonization. First, I want to be very clear about what Marxists mean when we argue that class struggles are the basis for social conflicts. And I highly recommend Domenico Lusurdo's book, Class Struggles, on this topic. By analyzing the work of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Mao, he shows that class struggles, which are struggles that develop upon the material basis of the means and resources that ensure life, should be conceived as a genus that includes multiple species. In addition to conflicts between exploiting classes and labor, these also include different types of struggles for emancipation. They include struggles led by people in colonized and semi-colonized social formations, and those led by the working class in capitalist metropoles, as well as struggles led by women against, among other things, what Lenin termed domestic slavery. Moreover, the ecological question is also understood as a primary site and stake of class struggle, as Marx and Engels recognized nature as a primary source of use values and long understood the mortal threat that capitalist relations of production pose to nature, including, of course, to humans, which, as Engels note, belong to nature and exist in its midst. Now, the Marxist understanding that class struggles can take a national form emerged directly from the analysis of imperialism and anti-colonial struggles. We see this in Marx's own assertions that a country can enrich itself at the expense of another country, just as a class can enrich itself at the expense of another class. And the understanding of class struggles taking a national form takes on even greater significance for Marxists in the 20th century, who were able to witness the full development of imperialism and the expansion of anti-colonial struggles. And this is certainly the case for Lenin, whose analysis for imperialism was foundational for understanding uneven development and dependency, as well as for politically situating anti-colonialism at the heart of the global communist movement. As I mentioned last week, Lenin argued that Eurocentric chauvinism has its material basis in the class struggles that comprise the imperialist world system. His famous study of imperialism showed how finance capital's extraction of profits from around the entire world resulted in several key historical tendencies: the polarization of the world economy, increased differences in rates of development between its component parts, and the emergence of a labor aristocracy in the imperial metropoles. This labor aristocracy is a stratum of the working class whose relative affluence, vis-a-vis workers globally, is owed to the monopolist super profits secured by its own national bourgeoisies via imperialist extraction. The material condition of this labor aristocracy can lead these workers to identify with the interests of their own national bourgeoisies over and against those of proletarians in colonized or neo-colonized parts of the world. Lenin harshly criticized this tendency and inserted the primary importance of national self-determination. Under his leadership, the Communist International was organized precisely to cut ties with pro-imperialist social chauvinism, and its anti-imperialist commitment to proletarian internationalism was also explicitly an anti-colonial program. Following Lenin, the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci also laid foundations for thinking about uneven development and the regional differentiation of labor. While imprisoned, Gramsci analyzed the so-called backwardness of southern Italy, his own birthplace, in relationship to the more affluent north. He argued that the north acted like a leech upon the resource-rich south, enriching northern ruling classes at the expense of the southern population. And he distinguished this class-based analysis from contemporaneous culturalist explanations being circulated by social scientists, which attributed the poverty of Italy's south to the purported innate temperament of its inhabitants. Now, Lenin and Gramsci's analyses also laid the foundation, crucial foundation for the development of the theory of internal colonialism, which has been important for understanding the persistence of colonial relations within modern capitalist nation-states. While this term was coined by C. Wright Mills and was developed by Pablo González Casanova and Rodolfo Stavenhagen in the 1960s through their study of the conditions faced by indigenous Mexicans. For González Casanova, internal colonialism describes a form of economic, political, administrative, military, and cultural domination of a population that takes place within the territory of a single nation-state. And it is produced and maintained by policies pertaining to the expansion of markets and frontiers of capitalist accumulation. Because its specific structure inheres in a cultural heterogeneity that was established through colonial conquest, internal colonialism accentuates ascriptive ideologies, that is, ideologies that impute essential features to groups of people in order to sort them into hierarchies. Now, explicitly building on the Leninist analyses of dependency, this theory of internal colonialism calls attention to the ways that, quote, exploitation, domination, discrimination, and exclusion of colonial workers by foreign and national capital takes place both within and outside national borders. And Gonzalo Casanova makes crystal clear that internal colonialism is an expression of class struggle and that it should be understood in the context of the socialist struggle for state power and the creation of a multinational or multi-ethnic state. He also is very clear that efforts to deny its material basis in class struggle actually bolsters colonial and neo-colonial policies, encouraging a kind of impotent fetishization of cultural difference. I also just want to note that one of Gramsci's contemporaries, the Peruvian communist José Carlos Mariátegui, utilized Marx's methods to analyze Peruvian society, and particularly its dependent economy, its anti-indigenous racism, and the conditions faced by indigenous peasants. He identified in Peru the coexistence of multiple codependent economic forms, including those that were apparently feudal, but he also showed how all of these were subordinate to the global capitalist market. He was engaged with the debates with the Comintern regarding the appropriate response to internal colonialism in the Andes, and against the Comintern's support for the creation of an independent indigenous republic, Mariátegui argued that instead indigenous Peruvians should be protagonists in a national struggle for socialism in unity with non-indigenous workers. Now, these early 20th century analyses of the racist stratification of labor and the articulation of distinct economic forms would be further developed in the 1960s by Marxists in Latin America associated with dependency theory. Dependency theorists demonstrated how social features considered to be pre-capitalist, including coercive modes of extracting surplus value from workers, were in fact results of the particular ways in which certain regions and peoples were incorporated into the global imperialist capitalist system. That is, these features did not persist in spite of the threat of capitalist modernity, but because of it. For example, the Brazilian communist Rui Mauro Marini argued that imperialist capitalism relies on the super exploitation of the labor of a sector of the proletariat, which entails very low wages and precarious and harsh working conditions. And of course, the super exploitation of one sector of the global working class works to put downward pressure on wages for all workers. Now, Marini and other dependency theorists showed that superexploitation, dependency, underdevelopment, and the racist stratification of the global proletariat were inherent to capitalist reproduction in its imperialist phase. I also want to note that in the 1920s and 30s, communist militants in the US used Marxist-Leninist frameworks to analyze how imperialist capitalism enforced racist divisions among workers, creating colonial labor pools within modern nation states. That is, pools of super exploitable labor whose differentiation was rooted in colonial processes of conquest and domination. For example, African American communists argued that US capitals super exploited African American workers who constituted an oppressed nation within the US. Henry Haywood argued that the racist oppression and degradation to which African American workers were subjected within the US was rooted in this dynamic. Other communists built on these analyses to address the conditions of Mexicans in the US Southwest. The labor organizers and communists Emma Tenayuca and Homer Brooks argued that Mexicans were an oppressed national group who were incorporated into the US via its colonial expansion and made into super exploitable labor. And they argued that this dynamic not only explained Mexicans' low wages and relegation to menial work, but also their exclusion from social welfare, disenfranchisement, and subjection to racist segregation and dispossession. They also understood that the super exploitation of Mexicans within the US was a, quote, carryover to the United States of Wall Street's imperialist exploitation of Latin America. Now, this did not lead Tenayuca and Brooks to argue for a national liberation struggle. The fact that Chicano communist organizations of the New Left did argue for that strategy in the 1960s and 70s speaks to the distinct role of nationalist thought among the New Left in the US, which has also been attributed to the contemporaneous consolidation of a distinctly racial liberalism. Now, in closing, I want to turn to one strand of critique within anti-colonial Marxism that is specifically concerned with the lack of strategically viable analyses on the part of intellectuals and politicians who claim to speak in the interest of the oppressed. And I discussed this last week in outlining Domenico Lusurdo's critique of populism. Now, he is building on the critique of populism Lenin began developing in the 19th century when he was studying the Russian peasantry in the context of Russia's transition to capitalism. For Lenin, populism was a romantic, idealist, and ineffectual response to the dispossession and oppression of the peasantry. It accorded moral excellence to the oppressed and called for their liberation, but it failed to identify the social forces that were the actual causes of this oppression. Many Marxists, in addition to Lusurdo, have built on this critique, and I just want to mention the Mexican anthropologist Héctor Díaz-Polanco, who has decried the populism of intellectuals who claim they want to alleviate the oppression of indigenous Mexican agricultural workers and smallholders, but who fail to recognize the dynamics of capitalist accumulation that are in fact destroying these people's livelihoods. Now, the features of populism that have been critiqued by Marxists are precisely those that characterize the radical-seeming discourse of decolonial theory. These include the a priori rejection of political struggles oriented to taking state power, and their utopian and messianic approaches to social transformation. In decolonial theory, this messianism is regularly expressed in the notion that only some kind of radical alterity, untouched by the bogeyman of the so-called Western episteme, could transform colonial social relations. And the idealism of this theory reflects the particular disposition of professional intellectuals. It inflates the political import of ideas, totally detached from material practices, and it elevates the professional theorist's own concept of decolonization over and above the contradictory processes that characterize actual struggles against imperialism. And this is why, for all their talk of epistemological decolonization, these theorists never looked to examples of socialist states like Cuba that had actually done this through state policies. Now, most importantly, and as Bosordo makes clear, these theoretical tendencies have their objective basis in the class relations that are organized by the imperialist world system. In short, those who enjoy the wages of imperialism are more likely to have disdain for concrete struggles for liberation from it. It is in this precise sense that my critique of decolonial theorists is rooted in an analysis of their global standing, materially speaking, as part of an intellectual labor aristocracy. Because these theorists' claims about the, quote, geopolitics of knowledge amount to a culturalist and anti-dialectical dichotomization of Western thought and its others, they also lack a coherent account of how international class relations shape the production and dissemination of knowledge. And this includes their own theoretical products, which should be understood as products of the Imperial U.S. University. Bolivian sociologist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui has directly addressed decolonial theory's role in cultural imperialism, arguing that, quote, cultural studies departments of North American universities have created a jargon, a conceptual apparatus, and forms of reference and counter-reference that have isolated academic treatises from any obligation to dialogue with insurgent social forces. Yet when you read these theorists, they have plenty of prescriptions for politics of decolonization. And what does it consist? As I said before, it involves thinking differently. Their geographic determinism and idealist reductivism, which underlies the dismissal of intellectual and political traditions that have their purported origin in Europe, has its corollary in the presumption that tools for liberation must come from, quote-unquote, subaltern knowledges or indigenous thought. But precisely what thoughts and how these might comprise a viable strategy of decolonization is never specified. In fact, many decolonial theorists who make these pronouncements do not engage in empirical investigation and don't even work in indigenous languages. This lack of concreteness stems from the fact that what is actually being proffered under the sign of indigenous thought or border thinking or subaltern thought is the mythic promise of an extra-ideological subject, a figure of abstract alterity. It is little more than the warmed-over trope of the noble savage, as Vasquez Arroyo has argued. So I've aimed to show how the Marxist tradition has provided essential tools for both theoretically understanding and practically struggling against imperialism. And it also provides tools for understanding how decolonial theory actually bolsters imperialism by obscuring its operations and peddling as radical forms of thinking that have long been critiqued for being idealist, essentializing, racist, ahistorical, and strategically ineffectual. For these reasons, decolonial theorists should be understood as radical recuperators. This concept, which I'm borrowing from Gabriel Rockhill, identifies intellectuals who are publicly associated with emancipatory politics because of the way their work is marketed and how they present themselves as champions of the oppressed, when in fact the analyses they advance obscure the root causes of oppression and exploitation and undermine any basis for developing effective strategies to combat them. Radical recuperators play an essential role for the bourgeois cultural apparatus by policing the left border of critique. And the particular type of radical recuperation that decolonial theory performs should be understood as a response and product of the reality of neocolonialism and internal colonialism being intensified by the neoliberal phase of capitalist accumulation. It is also very much a product of ideological tendencies promoted in the imperialist university in this context. These include the promotion of culturalism, including in openly racial essentialist forms. Adolf Reed Jr. has done excellent work to show how this promotion of culturalism, as we see in US-style identity politics, is a manifestation of the class politics of a professional managerial class strata that advances its own material position by posing as spokespersons for oppressed racialized constituencies. Vivek Chibber has also identified the ways postcolonial theory has served a similar purpose for third world elites who make their careers in the US Academy as high priests of subaltern knowledge who actively bury materialist accounts of imperialism. Samir Amin makes the crucial point that the culturalism that saturates discourses promoted by the US professional managerial strata are an important ideological component of US imperialism. And finally, I just want to note that these theories are also bolstered by the undeserved authority that is accorded to anti-Marxist French theory within the US Academy, as the latter's formal celebration of difference and its rejection of totality, critique, and class analysis has given an aura of sophistication to idealist, essentialist, and ultimately reactionary theories. Thank you. So we can go ahead and open up to questions. Okay, we've got a couple here. Let's start here. And we'll take maybe, we'll go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Stefania. My question is about internal colonialism, and I'm wondering if you can tell us if we can take this concept and apply it to countries and places that have not been colonized physically. So for example, Eastern Europe, a country such as Romania. Could we say that internal colonialism is also taking place there, since I'm thinking that super exploitation, underdevelopment, and racist exploitation exists in these countries, and would that be helpful in understanding the contemporary situation of these post-socialist, now democratic neoliberal regimes, I should say?
Felix?
So thanks for both of the talks, which I found very illuminating. My question refers to something that Jennifer brought up, but perhaps it's relevant for both of you, I don't know. So you reconstructed decolonial theory as idealistic and only focusing on the epistemological frameworks and seeing them as the roots for colonial oppression. And I sort of want to play devil's advocate in a way and sort of maybe strengthen this position to hear your answer to it. Because, for example, I think that these epistemological frameworks do play a certain role, at least, in processes of colonization and maybe intellectual oppression. For example, yesterday with Roland, we saw that certain Chinese terms are not so well translatable into European languages and vice versa, which makes it hard to really understand processes and discourses in China, for example, if you only see them through a Western conceptual framework. And I just want to ask you what sort of role that plays in Marxist approaches that you put forward. Yeah.
We can take a couple more.
There's Nico.
Or you can take
Yeah, there's Nico and someone else.
Okay. Go ahead and
Yeah, I have two short questions. I was wondering to what extent we should decolonize. I'm using the word decolonize because I have no other word, but if you have one, you can propose. To what extent should we decolonize our theoretical frameworks? I read a lot of essays on Latin American literature that are written supposedly in the framework of decolonial studies, but that have as theoretical frameworks, mainly Derrida or things like that. So to what extent should we just ban those references? Or what balance would you propose? My other question is, Jennifer, you used the term global south and global north. Would that be a better term than third world? If we want to address those different parts of the world.
We'll take one more question, maybe? Was it Nico?
Yeah. Okay. They can hear me. I think I was going to. Yeah, I don't know what's here. So two questions that I think they sort of apply to both of you. So first, Jennifer, you sort of mentioned Fanon, who is a figure who is kind of important for my work that I'm thinking a lot about. Is often taken now as a sort of like proto-postcolonial or even like Afro-pessimist theorist now. Fanon, of course, spent like the last 5 or 10 years of his life writing literal battle plans and tactics and strategies for the Algerian and anti-colonial revolution there. These are collected in like the mainstream press, Europe press, and toward the African Revolution. I recommend reading them. But of course, like one single chapter in Black Skin, White Masks is like earliest published text. regarding the experience of blackness in the colonial metropolis kind of sort of over-determine the rest of this catalog. So I just kind of wonder, do you have any theories or any thoughts on what makes writers like Gramsci or even so Fanon more almost ripe for a certain co-opting by a certain decolonial or post-colonial threat, which isn't just sort of critique of them as much as it is an understanding of the mechanisms of their co-optation? Because it's so interesting, figures like Che, like a markedly anti-colonial figure, it's not like they never touched any sort of like dialectical critique or progression on what Marx wrote, or that they never spoke of subjectivity, right? The new man is like so important for Che. And then the second question, and I think this is tangentially related to what Felix was getting at. We talked about the sort of Trojan horse strategy in the first day of the workshop, and I'm wondering about that as a sort of manner of reclaiming authors like these ones. For instance, Christina, you mentioned this sort of more materially based, it sounded like 1970s post-colonialism that I'm really unfamiliar with. So I'd definitely be interested in any sort of bibliography or information on how they were sort of co-opted into post-colonialism and cultural studies, and how that post-colonialism became today's post-colonialism. Jennifer, I agree with you on the utility of certain insights, even from the modernity, coloniality, decoloniality collective. Quijano's writings on capitalism, colonial modernity, and transatlantic colonialism come to mind. Not coloniality, it's a different term. So I'm also sort of interested in reclaiming these sort of authors. A lot of them even were like tangentially related to dependency theorists. I think of like Wallerstein, who worked both with figures like Quijano and with sort of more materially based figures like Andre Gunderbroek. This sort of critique of the modern world system as based off like this vague shift in popular sensibility or governing philosophies, a la Foucault, for instance, rather than it being based on like a transition to a new world economy, seems quite flippant and something that's worth rebutting. So I just want to know, do you think here that there is a value in sort of dialectical employment and critique of strains such as MCD in a manner that is sort of legible to the liberal academy while reasserting a sort of materialist or anti-colonial bent to them? Thank you guys so much.
Okay, I'll respond to these as many as I can. I think on the question of internal colonialism, I don't know enough about the case of Eastern Europe to really speak to that, but I would really highly recommend an essay by Donald Harris, where he, and I can send you the exact reference of it, but he was a Marxist, I'm not sure, political scientist, or who was a professor at Stanford, who had a really interesting critique of the way that the concept of internal colonialism was being applied to talk about like African American communities within the US, as it was often used by, in the 60s and 70s. And so I think what his work does very usefully is kind of lay out precisely what features would kind of need to apply, like unequal exchange, for example, to make it a kind of appropriate framework to think about. So and I'd be happy to share that with you. I think about, okay, the question of Fanon, what makes certain writers ripe for co-opting is an interesting question. And here again, I would also like to just point to the work of somebody who's written really explicitly on this, and that's Benita Perry's writing on Fanon, which is, she's a Marxist who has, from South Africa, who has written really excellent critiques of post-colonial theory. And one of the things she points out too is that Fanon's writing has certain aspects that are contradictory, as many people's writing does, and that there are also ways that perhaps that has facilitated the kind of cherry picking that I think you were pointing to. And that there's also aspects of his work that are not really fully developed theories, but then get treated as such, and kind of, a single word gets kind of repeated in this almost oracular way, or not a single phrase or something like this, like the idea that you have to stretch Marxism to account for race or something like that. I've heard that, repeated ad nauseum without actually being explained whenever it's invoked. And that's the kind of, and that's one of the things that I think we have to be very careful about sometimes, that habit of that academic discourse encourages, where it's like, just because X person said it or Y person said it, we don't have to actually justify what they're saying, which also really lends itself again to this kind of really incomplete engagement with somebody's thought or historical contextualization of somebody's thought, like you're talking about like Fanon as an actual, revolutionary really engaged with the Algerian liberation struggle. I mean, and I think the misuses of Fanon's work are really egregious. And this is included, for example, like really the erasure of his engagement with the Algerian liberation struggle by people who have kind of taken his work towards a kind of almost essentialist reading that it's all about anti-blackness, and have even, and this is something that John Harfouche, who's been an earlier guest in the critical theory workshop, has also written about. I recommend his writing on the kind of misuses of Fanon. Also, Todd Cronin wrote a really good piece, I think earlier this year or last year, on the misuses of Fanon. In terms of your question about the Trojan horse strategy and the kind of usefulness of some of these terms, I have to say that I don't find them useful anymore. I take your point about, and I think you're very right, that, I think Quijano's work should be differentiated from Mignolo and company, and Quijano comes from dependency theory and from, a long publication history and research on like peasant movements in the Andes. So there's a lot more substance to his work than we get in some of these kind of more just theoretical treatises that take up the term coloniality. But I also find that, and he's somebody who has also had some more serious engagements with Marxist thought, even though he, by the 90s when he writes that essay on coloniality of power, he's quite anti-Marxist in his methods. But again, I guess I find the idea of like the coloniality of power to just not be very useful, and precisely for somebody who has come out of dependency theory, where there are just decades of theorizing of how do we actually understand why these colonial social relations persist, and to instead just overlay that with a term that is more descriptive than analytic. Because that's the problem with this category, colonial. And when I was trying to say where it kind of basically just refers us to this almost metaphysical model of power whose own mechanisms aren't explained, that's to me not a very useful concept compared with everything else I was trying, I was laying out. And it's, it's also kind of lends itself to this type of thinking where the superstructural is just co-constitutive with infrastructural elements. I mean, to put it bluntly, where it just says that, okay, racism and capitalist social relations coexist. Well, we know that. I mean, that's not anything new, but like why they change, why they take on certain forms, and what are the actual social agents that are responsible and social processes that are responsible for, those are the questions we have to be able to answer. So this kind of, just referring this all to a model of power that has existed since the conquest, to me doesn't give us any kind of real purchase on those processes. In terms of, and this is the last thing I'll say, then I'll turn it over to Christina, about Felix's question of doesn't the epistemological matter? Absolutely, and I do think, and I guess this is why I also wanted to say, like if you look at Marxist theories of neocolonialism, for example, there's enormous concern with knowledge production and its place in colonialism and neocolonialism. You can look at Walter Rodney writes about it. You can look at studies of cultural imperialism, like very famous studies by Armand Matelard, who's written about this. But what I guess those do is they also provide us a way of understanding where those epistemological frameworks are coming from and why they have so much power and what exactly the work that they're doing is. And so even if you think of something like, okay, like what you mentioned the other day about why there's a kind of obliviousness and complete ignorance towards Chinese scholarship within the US Academy, Well, that, we can't, I mean, there's ways to explain that in regard to the role of US imperialism, its hostility, you know, towards China's anti-colonial struggle, the kind of ignorance that is cultivated within the, you know, US Academy because of the, you know, because of the position that the US state plays geopolitically. Those are all questions that we have to be able to ask, and we have to be able to answer, most importantly, to really understand, you know, why these epistemological frameworks, where they're coming from, and where they're getting their power. And so that's why I think, and that's, I guess, the point, is I'm not saying that these things don't matter, but they can't be just named and then treated as some kind of transcendent cause without themselves being historicized and explained. In order to do that work, we have to have a totality critique and a class analysis.
Thank you very much for those questions. So the one on internal colonialism, this is something that the whole question of Eastern Europe has interested me immensely for a very long time. Not that it's not something I've researched or anything, but sort of from a political point of view, it's something that I've found really, really fascinating. And I spent a couple of years in Germany on a postdoc, and I worked with a number of PhD students who came from the former Eastern Germany, who then experienced sort of all of these disadvantages and sort of regarded as parochial, parochial backwards people who just sort of came in from the rural areas. And I think that several East German academics found the language of colonialism immensely useful because it sort of enabled them to express how their country had been taken over, labor power, stripped of its labor power, forced deindustrialization, and that obviously also goes for Romania and Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia and so on. And so I definitely think it has some merit to it, but at the same time, it's something that is then rejected by the powers that be, because I know that sort of an East German woman had applied for discrimination because she applied for a job, got all her papers back, and it had all said, you know, East Germany, or Aussie throughout, and so she was sort of she was rejected for the position, and so she tried to sue for discrimination, and the only category she could sue within was sort of postcolonial, ethnic discrimination, and that was dismissed in court, and so it created precedents for all kinds of things of that nature. And so I'm not really answering, but I'm sort of just talking with you about it, because I think there are some issues there that definitely need addressing that have been grossly overlooked. But I think Neil Lazarus, in the study that you mentioned, also addresses some of the stuff with East Germany, or not Eastern Europe, and I'll definitely send some things your way if I remember something. So, I also just wanted to, the question about decolonizing the theoretical frameworks and stuff, because I also don't sort of have a direct answer, but I think I try to think of it in terms of how to assess the role of religion with it, because religion also is a kind of weird thing that can be used for all kinds of reactionary purposes, but it also at the same time obviously has enormous meaning for many people, and so the way of sort of trying to balance that as acknowledging that it has some importance, but trying to assign a proper role for it so that it doesn't become the overall structure that then sort of has a sort of reactionary push that instead I don't know. Perhaps that's not the best analogy, but I was just sort of trying to think about how to acknowledge its importance without giving it too much power. And because I also find that lots of these theoretical issues are quite helpful to work with to a certain extent, but without allowing them to sort of dominate. And I it's a balance I'm constantly working with, but I do find it sort of as a way also just of communicating with people who are theoretically invested, and as a way of sort of trying to sort of yes, communicate, discuss, and perhaps convince some people on their own ground. Yeah, and just the one on Fanon, I was just struck by, because when I remember I was looking into some other post-colonial, so the whole post-colonial thing, that one of the things that I found really interesting is that much of the sort of revolutionary 70s stuff is sort of, largely speaking, things that arise from the French former colonized countries, whereas post-colonial is really dominated by British imperialism, and there's something in that that I think is important. I haven't quite thought it through yet, but that's definitely something I think might be worth thinking about. Anyway, that's all I have to say for now.
Well, let's take another round of questions. Sabrina?
Yeah, thank you both so much. This was brilliant. I noticed a little bit of discussion in both of your talks around literature, and I guess I just wanted to ask, it's kind of similar to the Fanon question, why is literature suitable to these decolonial and post-colonial and Afro-pessimist and so on approaches, such that Marxist interventions actually become marginalized within them. And I'm thinking particularly about the fiction industry and the production of like novels that also kind of suit these intellectual interventions that you're talking about, that they kind of work hand in hand to reinforce one another, such that it seems like the sort of on the ground narratives that are produced by the identities that are being talked about are also representing their own experience in the same way as the intellectuals are representing their experience. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay, thank you. Yanis?
About Lenin's critique of populism. So I wonder how this relates to the recent resurgence of the politics of commons among certain leftists, because Lenin criticized those who projected an undifferentiated peasantry, and today autonomous Marxists, Silvia Federici for instance, they also categorize pre-capitalist structures as commons, which can be utilized for a direct transition to socialism. So Federici has criticized industrialization and modernity output, and this has also been used in Latin America to criticize the resource nationalism of the pink-tide government. So how does it relate to post-colonial theory, and what are its shortcomings?
Okay, Jonathan?
Good evening. Excellent lecture. I appreciate it. My question is regarding internal colony theory. I'm trying to be practical about putting these theories into practice on the ground. So regarding internal colonialism theory, and it's been, and maybe we work from Charles Penhughes, it talks about how it's very stratified, right? Is the internal colony in Texas the same or connected to the internal colony in New York, whatnot, what have you? And again, I'm speaking very Western American right now. And so I'm wondering how, that stratification plays a role in organizing, overcoming the race-class struggle. Because I'm thinking also in terms of Pan-Africanism and the contemporary movement of like these American descendants of slaves, and how that is now a battleground before we can even move forward. I hope there's a lot of thoughts in my head right now concerning this, so I'm just kind of rambling. I'm trying to get an answer about how we can move past or make progress in that race-class struggle.
Good, okay.
just so you know, there was a question down here too.
Okay.
I don't know if you have time for it.
Oh, I think we've got time. I just want to, yeah. We'll take Reese.
Hi, thank you so much for your talks. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the ontological status of the categories of nation and class as they relate to one another, particularly based in Leninist philosophy. I've seen a few different interpretations of Lenin, some of which here would position nation and class as different kinds of categories that we have to analyze together and in relation to one another. Well, it seems that through both of your talks that nation could be understood also, or perhaps instead, as an expression of a kind of class relation. So I'm wondering if you could speak to the relationship between these two categories and what their material basis is, if they have separate bases that are different, necessarily entangled, but still based in the same material reality, or if one is ultimately still an expression of the other, or something in that realm, if you could speak to that ontological question. Thank you.
And Baiju?
Hello. Could you please elaborate on those decolonialist approaches that do not follow the Marxist tradition, and how do they contribute to decolonialist approach? How do they contribute and how do they critique the Marxian approach?
Thank you. I wanted to start with Sabrina's question, and I think one of the things in the Jameson article that I mentioned, because he is a literary scholar and sort of finds and sort of develops his theory through engagement with literature in a way that I found immensely productive. But when he criticizes Burke, he says that the reason for literature being able to take on this role is precisely the discovery of language or rediscovery of language as a separate realm of sort of consciousness, as it were, with the whole. And I'm assuming he's referring to Saussure and that whole sort of revival, and that language then takes on a sort of a separate existence that then means that it can be sort of symbolized and take on a world of its own, and in that way things sort of be analyzed in a way that means it doesn't have any impact on the actual rest of the world, or whatever reality, or however we want to frame that. And that's precisely what Jameson is critiquing Burke of doing, that he's remaining within that particular mindset of literature and literary genres. And Jameson's own analysis in The Political Unconscious sort of moves beyond and situates all of these genres in the bigger realm of history and class struggle. But what you also made me think about was that there are different sort of, in Denmark, literature is the chief area of struggle in terms of nationality and colonialism and so on, whereas in Australia, and this is something I've discussed with Roland, history is the area, is the sort of arena onto which all of these battles are played out. And I find that actually a really interesting sort of distinction, not that it has anything to do with what you were asking, but that just made me think about it, and I thought I'd mention it. Which one was... I'll just leave that for now, and I'll think about some of the other questions and come back to that a bit later, if that's right.
Yeah. I think some of Sabrina, I appreciated that question, and just some, thoughts that came to mind, and I would be that it is, I think, also in the U.S. where a lot of the kind of some of the theoretical tendencies that are the, anti-Marxist French theory really is institutionalized in the US in like literature and comparative literature departments, because at that point, you don't have continental philosophy and philosophy departments. So a lot of this theory that becomes, theory with a capital T, that becomes the kind of basis for these kinds of anti-Marxist, various iterations of anti-Marxist thought really enter, I think, in the US Academy in those, precisely in those, in literary departments. So I think that has something to do with it. As well as, the way that you have, and I know, and I'm saying this as much as a self-critique as somebody trained in, in these fields, that there is a great, a wide berth for metaphorical thinking in literary studies, in the way that it's been institutionalized, that it's kind of normalized to make very enormous political claims that kind of just hang on like metaphorical association, or that don't have to ever be accountable to history or to actual political constituencies. And that, I think, is the norm for how a lot of theorizing happens around in the cultural studies, literary studies in the US academies, that makes it a really ripe ground for these kind of political discourses that in some ways are able to then really isolate themselves from kind of actual political struggles, but are always but can seem to be speaking a very radical politics because they exist in this super rarefied context. I also think, the question you asked about fiction was really interesting, but I do think that, and I'm thinking of some of the critiques that have been written of Afro-pessimism, like, I believe it was Nick Mitchell's critique that was really excellent, and I'm hoping that that's the right one I'm referring to, but I believe that critique was also kind of talking about the kind of take-up of auto theory, and that this has become kind of widely embraced, where, like just subjectivism is really embraced as a basis of theorizing, and that is something that you do see in Afro-pessimism that is also kind of deployed in that regard as a kind of defense strategy as well against kind of questioning some of the claims. So I think that'd be a really interesting question to see that kind of embrace of auto theory is also kind of how that dovetails with, or maybe is a certain symptom of the way that just like real subjectivism is being kind of widely embraced and kind of in an uncritical way in certain forms of literary study. And literary production, as you mentioned. I think, the question about the politics of the commons is a really interesting one, and I can't speak that in Federici's work that much in detail, but I would say that I would really recommend Radhika Desai, who spoke in the workshop last year, who is a Marxist political economist from Canada, has written very explicitly a kind of Marxist critique of the kind of discourse of the commons. And as that discourse has been kind of made the commons as into this, into something that can be a lot of things, not how it's like treated necessarily, in Marxist thought. And so I would recommend that, and I'll also, send that particular essay. But I do think that the larger issue that you are talking about kind of points in some ways to this kind of, it's a very anarchist-inflected, the kind of anarchist-inflected autonomous Marxist school of thinking that I think you would probably situate Federici in. And that has, enormous suspicion for, and almost across the board, disdain for kind of struggles that are more oriented towards taking state power, or actual, efforts by workers' parties to use the state as an instrument of reform. And you're absolutely right that has also found expression in, for example, like real antipathy to the projects of like pink tide governments in trying to assert a kind of resource nationalism or developmental projects that of course have enormous contradictions, you know, also because we're talking about development happening in a context of, you know, dependency and basically countries trying to develop in a way to kind of break the chains of imperialism, but also having to do that, you know, oftentimes as in developing, you know, through extractive industries that are all, you know, that take up enormous swaths of territory, that produce all kinds of contradictions with indigenous and rural, you know, populations, etc. And there's been a way, and a very predominant way I've seen of kind of interpreting those conflicts in this kind of manner that just says, well, all development is bad. And then also kind of reads development in this very flat way, like it's just this kind of, again, product of a Western episteme that's just productivist and et cetera, without really taking, and I think that kind of thinking is, I think sometimes very much promoted by this kind of anarchist, inflected, autonomist discourse, definitely by a lot of kind of decolonial theorists, that are, you know, I think again can be, while on one hand acknowledging very real, as I said, contradictions and conflicts that I don't want to, you know, paper over, but when that goes in the direction of just, you know, decrying development across the board, or, you know, in some cases it's really taken the case of intellectuals actively militating against leftist governments, you know, when we think of something like in Ecuador, I think that's a very mistaken kind of direction to go in, that can sometimes, you know, reflect this kind of utopian approach to social transformation, like, you know, we all want to have forms of development that are not going to, you know, be ecologically destructive, and that could, you know, be democratic in the way, you know, they take place. But but the struggle to get there is a very complex one, and intellectuals just kind of dismissing that struggle really doesn't help. And I do think it's also a tendency, and this is something that Losordo has actually written a lot about. This is something I really appreciated about his work, because it also inspired a kind of self-critique of my own, because I was very influenced at one point by that kind of autonomous Marxist line. But that he's been very good, I think, and his work has been very good about also positioning this kind of, you know, flat, unilateral dismissal of development and the exigencies of development as something that tends to reflect the class position of people from, you know, the imperialist world, for whom kind of the realities that a lot of people, most people in the world actually need development, are just kind of just being oblivious to that. Do you know what I mean? It's one thing to be in New York and say, yeah, who needs more resource extraction? We have, you know, we have it from the whole world, you know, why should they do it? Then actually looking at the real material needs for development, which, like, you know, Roland was speaking about yesterday. So that is, and I do think that kind of utopian thinking plagues a lot of the kind of, and to take a kind of autonomous discourse that also sometimes takes this kind of neo-indigenist form. Atilio Boron is, I think, has some really good, he's an Argentine political theorist who also really, I think, who does a good job of critiquing that while also really understanding that the kind of struggles, that the conflicts around, say, development would be best handled by, you know, socialist states that would then, you know, that actually have an interest in developing, say, like the plurinational states, right? And in developing democratic consultation around around development, but that also has to be part of a project of using state power to that end. Let's see.
I can say something.
Yeah.
Yep. Because I've now had a chance to sort of think and regroup and things, and I just wanted to return to the thing about just the literature thing, because I also thought about that the whole sort of idea of literature and its development in the 19th century and the sort of developments of plot and character and development and so on, I think might also be quite interesting to think along with this for some reason. But and the reason I'm thinking about this is because in biblical studies, for example, it became immensely popular to sort of use literary methods to analyze biblical texts, and you really got into trouble when you're trying to use genres and understandings from literary theory to texts that are from the first century and so don't have an idea of plot in quite the same way, or character development and so on. And so I found that also quite productive as a way of thinking about what works and what doesn't. But it also indicates the strength of this literary sensibility and the power that literature has in framing certain ways of thinking. And that, of course, connects. Roland mentioned Benedict Anderson yesterday and the whole imagined communities discussion with the connection between the whole sort of development of literature and newspapers and nationalism, and that then would take me on to Reese's question. This all makes sense in my own head. I don't know if it makes sense to anyone else, but because I then the question of, I got a bit confused when you talked about ontological categories of nation and class, so I'll just talk about what I think you were asking. And because nationalism, of course, is a big deal in anti-colonial struggles, but then on the other hand, nationalism became really dangerous for, you know, the global movements of the 20th century, socialist movement. There you are, socialist movement and the feminist movement, and some of the stuff that I've been working with, a global Christian movement, the Moravian Brethren, also really were challenged in the early 20th century with ideas of nationalism that broke up that unity that they had managed to sort of hold on to before then. And so there is sort of, yes, I mean, it's both, of course, productive, but then it has to be reined in some way, and I think that was what was happening in the Soviet Union, and I mentioned that in the article on the Second World with the management of nationalism within the Soviet Union, where they were trying to sort of use class as the base and then acknowledge the importance of nationalism and belonging to a nation, and in a way that it didn't break the class allegiance. And I wonder whether some of those solutions that were used in the Soviet Union then also would be helpful to think through Jonathan's question. Jonathan's question of stratification and overcoming race and class. But that's still just, you know, something perhaps to think a bit more about, for me anyway, and not a ready answer. But at least I think somewhere along the way of acknowledging no, I'm sorry, I stopped. I apologize, but if any of you have an intuitive idea of what I'm trying to say, that's great. Sorry.
I just wanted to add, thank you, because it helped me think through a few other things as well, just to the point of nation versus class, I guess just what I wanted to say, that what I find very useful about what I learned about those categories, you know, in Marxist thought, is this understanding that in certain contexts, the predominant form that class struggle is taking a national form. Which is not to say that class and nation are the same thing, but if we're thinking, right, of class struggles, that these struggles over the means and resources that ensure life, that particularly in the context of imperialism and colonialism, that can be the primary form that class struggle is taking is taking this national form, and that has to be, and I get, and this is what, that has to also be understood in its articulation with class struggles that are also taking other forms, like how you would, like how Marx is talking about that the colonial situation that, England has to Ireland was going to cripple the workers' movement in England because of the kind of racism that that was being embraced by English workers, right? So that was actually understanding that the national struggle that is happening in the context of colonialism was essential for understanding the possibilities of a class struggle between labor and capital within the imperialist country, right? So it's more, I think, of this kind of almost like methodological insistence of understanding that these class struggles take different forms, as history unfolds. That in the context of imperialism, they often do take a form of national struggles, but that this again has to also be understood with the way that they're articulated with the class struggles taking other forms, right? Which is also something that I think, like Marxist feminists do very well in what, the analysis of, for example, how class struggles that take place around gender are articulated with imperialism, for example, right? How imperialism exacerbates the kind of domination and exploitation of women. This is something that Marxist feminists like Marta Jimenez have talked about. It's something that Domenico Losurdo talks about. So this is just another example that, of why it's so useful to understand that these class struggles take these different forms that have to be accounted for also in their interrelation. And I just quickly, there was the question about how do decolonial theorists critique or contribute to Marxism, and just to sum up my talk, my point was that decolonial theorists are opposed to Marxism, and they don't contribute to it. They are instead trying to really bury and invisibilize all of its contributions. And methodologically, they're also completely opposed to it. Let's see. Oh, and I think I just wanted to the other question about literature and what do we do? Do we decolonize our discourses and our references? What do we do with all of, do we stop citing European authors or something like this? And I guess from, speaking from the position of somebody in the US university, I think it's absolutely important that people read more than just the products of, imperial universities, and that and I know that the structures of advancement and all those things discourage that, and then rather encourage a kind of isolation to what's been published by academic presses, from elite institutions. So that is a kind of work that people usually have to do against the imperatives of institutional uplift. But that's not to say that we just can't refer to, the, canonized figures, but I do think that it's very important to be able to situate their work and situate it politically and situate it historically, so that if we are using, hopefully not Derrida to talk about, Latin American literature or whatever, that we know, that we aren't just invoking it as this kind of model into which we plug all of this data, which is, again, that was how I was taught to apply theory, that it has this kind of authority. I don't know where, its own forms of thought were coming from. I didn't really know their history, but that it would be kind of a model that I could plug in whatever into. And whatever, raw material I had, it would be become a lot fancier if I could, talk about it with reference to some French theorists. And I think that's what's the real problem, because we don't then have tools to really understand what these theoretical models are really about. And I really appreciated what Christina said about, for example, postcolonialism. Postcolonial theory is always hiding its own history and where it's coming from, and I think that's true of a lot of these theoretical discourses. And it's one of the things that I've, for example, really appreciated about Gabriel's work in not properly historicizing a lot of the anti-Marxist French theory, that I was brought up on, again, more in this kind of like biblical manner, the way you relate to it. And that even if you don't understand it completely, it's okay, nobody does, but you should use it anyway, And it's been really helpful to actually understand it, to say, oh no, maybe a lot of this is actually reactionary, or it's, and that's, or, maybe it's like explicitly recuperating Nazis in the case of a lot of this French theory, and to actually be able to, so if you're using it, and it is still a useful tool, I think it can only be really useful when we really understand its history. Let's see, do we have other questions?
Actually,
okay.
once since the beginning.
Okay, sorry.
You cannot see him.
Okay, go ahead.
You guys can hear me? Yeah. First, before I ask my question, I'm like an evangelist for Aja's Amin, who is referencing Christina's work. Please, as a personal favor to me, read Aja's Amin. Particularly, his work on Rushdie, which I can send you guys, and he made me look at Edward Said like a dirty liberal, and it was like my whole life changed. But related to that, I think what's really interesting, Christina, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this in the time we have, is that in one of the articles, what you see over and over again are South Asian intellectuals. And what's important about historicizing the post-colonial subaltern studies is that fundamentally these were South Asian elites, upper caste elites who were arriving in the imperial court. So, from the 60s it started with Naipaul, and it works all the way through with Spivak, with Salman Rushdie, Chakrabarti, Gyan Pandey, et cetera, et cetera. And what was fundamental, I think, about them being from the subcontinent, and we have a huge ignorance in the West of the subcontinent, is that they're English speaking. It wasn't Chinese native collaborators. It wasn't people from the Francophone world. It was particularly that these Indian elites often speak better English than people who are from England and America and are educated in a certain kind of way, and they became a kind of bulwark. For example, Rushdie can basically, and Homi Bhabha, who I encountered very many times personally and is just as unintelligible in real life as he is in the book, if not worse. But one of the things was that they provided a kind of cover for literary studies and literary production to say, oh, your experience as an Indian or from the subcontinent or from the colonial world and the Africans and the Latin Americans as well, only thing you have to criticize is, oh, what the British did, what the French did, what the Spanish did, and instead of looking at, well, Rushdie and Homi Bhabha and Spivak all come from, societies in which they are the dominant people. They have servants, they have serfs, they have peasants, they are landlords. They have no interest in the Communist Party of India, let me tell you. But I was wondering, Christina, how that sort of relates to like, for example, you mentioned a lot of the relationship with the Soviet Union and its cultural production, how it influenced the Third World. And maybe this sort of piece about the fact that these, again, these South Asian intellectuals come up over and over again in your work, how that sort of works. Sorry, I just put that.
There's another question.
Another question over here? Sorry.
Yes,
Oh.
I wanted to ask a question. Should I use the microphone?
Yes,
Or?
so that people really can hear. I'm going to say your name.
My name is Chen Rai. So my question is for Jennifer, and specifically regarding the nuanced discourse of gender. So it is to my understanding that a lot of Marxist feminists argues that gender is a oppressive concept and practice, such as federigi, and what's still having to work was heterosexual terminologies. And I think opportunities arise when indigenous thinker such as Anzaldúa was able to extract from alternative epistemologies in terms of concept like mestiza, and so provides vocabularies beyond the binary. So I was just want to ask if you see, or your work would represent the idea of seeing an opportunity in this case of how indigenous culture studies could work with Marxist theory and practice, or maybe it would still be a case where we produce without, quote, like more descriptive than analytic. I think that's the question.
Christina, I had a question. Sorry, I had a question about earlier in your talk you mentioned that maybe by way of Gabriel's own work you learned that there was something kind of insidious about the ascendancy of post-colonial theory, particularly in like literary criticism. And I've been dwelling on that particularly because, like, of the big three post-colonial literary critics, all of them have had endowed chairs at Ivy League schools. And at my own university, a big post-colonial person, not a literary critic, John Komarov, has become embroiled in a lot of terrible stuff recently and has been able to do it with impunity from the university. And I guess, I just kind of wanted to hear about where you might think some of that impunity is coming from, why the university has a vested interest in this kind of thought.
I think we have time for just one last
Yes,
one. We have to go?
Well, it's
Okay.
5 till, and they're
Okay.
going to chase us out.
Okay, about 5 minutes. Okay. I'll be really briefly. I just wanted to, on the question of, I think there's certainly possibilities for indigenous thought to work in, to work with Marxism. And I'm not arguing against that. I'm arguing for rather this very superficial kind of invocation of indigenous thought that is more like as a symbol of indigenous thought, which is the way that it gets invoked in decolonial theory, which is never going into the details of the specificities of this indigenous thought or the political strategies that might come from it. In regard to Anzaldúa, so Anzaldúa is a Chicana theorist whose whose use of the kind of concept of mestizaje has actually been really deeply critiqued from the kind of perspective of the way that the concept of mestizaje, as it really develops as part of state policy in Mexico and then is later adopted by Chicanos, has its own a very important history of a kind of anti-indigenous racism insofar as this kind of idea of biological intermixing was kind of part of this, part of an anti-indigenous project that, and this has been something that because the idea of mestizaje was taken up by Chicanos, in the context of the Chicano liberation movement in the 60s, the concept is resignified, but then when it gets deployed, by Anzaldúa in often a very metaphorical way, there's not sufficient attention, I think, to the actual, history and uses of that term in, beyond the U.S. national context. So I just wanted to flag that. No, go ahead.
I simply don't know what to say, actually. I'm sorry. I really like both questions, and I'd like to chat more about it, but right now my brain is completely paralyzed, and so I was wondering whether we could take it one by one instead. Thanks, and then we can wrap up. And
that sounds good. Well, thank you. Okay, wonderful. Well, we are out of time in any case, so thank you all for the wonderful questions, and thank you.